Temporo fakarasham. Nishram shikaramishtaroramata. Im niarumashtakara. Nishterem korok. Miaftemokara tisharat pranaka. Kiara sharam saraniya. Kurmeshtatarsapo kurmatindi trishem. Kadi armutsite mishoro katiteretsa moftitarish. Kiarmishtitarish ate poromatatakaranishtitarashtakara muftitarish kedim shitet. Hachnani nishara nishtaparamatakadarashta denekaresh. Kiam setarasham of the koro shatanenashtakatena shifte patrakotishtit. Kan asteram for akadenischtem of farakat shi. Niafte pekorosham of tetarasakatinish tatare takadamasef tetrakaneteraseftemo. Akadenishadi konzietriste. Shiftemo karashtefdemo teninnishtete kareshta porumad akad eramatuninikatidere shofaraskati khan enemu fartek kinish. Nia foporumashta karashafte perokaranete takadishteterem siftimakorum katiana koroshaterenaka kietarish. Nia psorosh katitaresh katiteremoporo faparan shit ereta kotini metro safte kanini shara kakni kereshan. Nisireshamofte karasharefte pokoro masinishtere kadanishamofara kiara kiara naka. Nishtadaraskaro sinishtakara takare ara kia kia kia. Nashkara siniftarashtamokoro nishara kadaram stitidarak. Panera shara mokorom. Simshtukoro shara kane toromashtakare tishatena kolum sinikade yenishtaram ftum sorak. Siniera pakunyamukurupyash. Yenimesarvashtakadeni sharamuftena padite. Sie pumashater shatakram sinikaram sinikaram sinikaram. Yerimina sharatis eramaftinia karayatsha. Kiamatara sharam forakanish. Siene pum sharat koet. Kiara kiara kiara. Whoops. Sorry if my eyes were closed. How y'all doing today? Does anybody have any questions? I'm heading over to why am I like this in the 000 lineage space. And I'm going to pick a few questions intuitively, which I haven't answered already. Oh gosh. Oops. Okay. Question one is, how do you conceptualize ancestry and working with it? Question two is, what are angels according to your gnosis? I guess I'm just like holding in case somebody else has a question they want. Okay, guess I'll start. I'm just gonna open that portal up. Okay. Thank you for the questions. I think the first question is from Lexi. I've been thinking about answering this question for a while because I end up talking about it quite a lot in like private work. And it's kind of like a long ass thing. I started thinking about perhaps like answering it more concisely in private work and then directing people to like a video where I've recorded a more expansive response. And then, yeah, I think it's like one of those questions where it kind of like made me want to do this container in the first place because I was just spending so much time saying more or less the same thing, which is like, has been kind of like forming into something which feels like it can be expressed in like a relatively like context-free way. And yeah, I guess like I'll like talk about that for a second. I would say that like being able to talk about these things in like one-on-one containers tends to be like much simpler because in some way, like whenever we're trying to communicate something, we have like two different semantic graphs, like one person and the other person. And then you could also say that people have different semantic graphs based on the context and then like what the context brings up in them or causes in their spirit to compartmentalize. So it can even be like a little bit more tricky. But yeah, I would say that like between, let's say for simplicity, two semantic graphs, it's relatively simple to construct like a geometry and communicate something which makes sense in my semantic graph, and then also makes sense in the other person's semantic graph, in a way that will not cause collisions to occur, and then have like what is being said misunderstood. And then of course those collisions and those misunderstandings can often lead to some form of attachment to the specific forms of what's being said, and that attachment can lead to things being repeated in different contexts verbatim, with perhaps like slightly lower of a degree of awareness of possible semantic graph collisions. And then these things sort of like tumble down the hill, colliding into many more different things until the meaning of what was communicated, or the meaning of the attempt to communicate something, is like fairly distant from the original intention. So talking about ancestry from the perspective, or from my perspective, of the perspective of my lineages in a relatively like large container, and then also with the intent to like record it and have that recording be like somewhat less strictly contained energetically, for me at least, and for like the way I'm guided, takes I would say like a lot more concentration. And the reason it takes more concentration is because in effect, like I'm trying to like make my awareness large enough to cover more timelines, and then try to pick a course through all of these timelines, which leads to something which allows me to honor the guarantee that I always have with these containers. And that guarantee is that I will not, or nothing in this container will happen that will lead to the creation or the reification of karma, and that some of the things that may happen in this container will lead to the exorcism of karmic accumulation and enmeshment, like the unraveling or the ripening or the resolution of karma. So I'm pretty interested to see what comes out of my mouth. So again, the question is, how do you conceptualize ancestry and working with it? So I'd say, like, in order to like kind of put some guards up around like how this might be interpreted, I'll say like what ancestry isn't to me and what it can be in many like current time contexts. So I think for a lot of people, when we talk about ancestry, we're literally talking about like our mother and our mother's father and mother, and our mother's mother's mother and father, and our mother's father's father and mother, and then the same thing on the patrilineal side. And like this is not what I talk about. And then there are some lineages which talk about ancestors as only perhaps people in that sort of like tree structure, or perhaps by like a slightly expanded definition, they're only speaking about ancestors who are like well, or they have alignment with like you could say like the blueprint of our incarnation. Or sometimes they talk about ancestors who have sort of resolved sufficient karma in order to be considered like helpful spiritual guides in this incarnation. And that's not exactly what I'm talking about either, although it's kind of closer. But yeah, typically when I talk about working with ancestry, I'm speaking about two different sets of ancestors, and one I call like sky ancestors, and then the other set I call earth ancestors. And I sometimes speak about like pretty much like every quanta of beingness, of the qualia of beingness in the one, or what I sometimes refer to as Tao or Shekinah. Um, but when I talk about working with ancestors, I would say I mostly talk about refining the connection to our sky ancestors and our earth ancestors. So I guess I'll start with earth ancestry because it feels like it's closer to what most people talk about when they talk about ancestry. Um, and I'll talk about it in a way which is like somewhat physical and metaphysical. So I would say that all of us have like a genome, right? And a particular like set of DNA. And we have empty DNA, which is what we inherit from our mother and our mother's mother and our mother's mother's mother. And we have Y DNA, which we inherit from our father and our father's father, etc. And then like everything in between is sort of like, um, in some sense, like random, but in another sense, I would say it assembles according to like the vibrational climate of one's conception. Um, and then I would say that like all of that genetic material has a particular way of interacting with like ether or like electromagnetic energy or yeah, like some people call it the vacuum. Um, and I would say that there's a sense in which like every geometry of genetic material in that sequence could be considered like a form of antenna. So they have both the ability to receive information and then also like send information um, in a way that I would say is transmitted outside the time of like our realm. So when people talk about like ancestral communication, I would say that there is like, you could say like roughly speaking, like karma on our side of that mirror, which reduces or obstructs our clarity when it comes to interacting with that antenna. And then on the other side, you could say that that antenna potentially connects us to all other beings who also had that geometric arrangement in their genetic sequencing. And they are also obstructed from clarity when it comes to sending and receiving information through that antenna, which is like what, people would like kind of in a hand wavy way refer to it as karma. And so like when I think about earth ancestors, I think about all beings who have like clarified their connection to that antenna. And then I would say that working with earth ancestors is to some extent like clarifying our relationship with all of those geometries, and then also working through the other side to try and get to the point where we can resolve karma on behalf of our ancestors. So like I feel like something that kind of comes up that's worth saying is that like in some sense you can imagine that like if you have a wall and there's two people on different sides of the wall and they're sort of like singing at the same um frequency or singing something very similar, then the wall is going to like sort of reverberate with like the waveform pattern of what they're singing. So like even if the connection between either person and the antenna is slightly off, there are going to be some like resonant frequencies, and that's going to result in like some level of communication through the antenna. And I'd say like often following the guidance which comes through in those sort of like blips of resonance or maybe like larger spans of resonance will often lead us to experience things that make it possible for us to clarify our connection with that antenna, and also to clarify the connection of an ancestor with that antenna. And this kind of like follows like the overall principle of like acoustic superposition and noise canceling headphones, right? So if you can imagine that like unresolved waveforms are kind of coming through and causing resonance through the antenna, and then we have an experience which allows us to feel something which has like the shape of that unresolved karma, and then we're able to like harmonize in our body and our nervous system what's coming through, then we can also like use that frequency to like harmonize what's happening on the other side of the antenna. And then both I and the other ancestor on the other side end up with a clearer connection and clearer communication. Another thing that's kind of coming up as worth saying is that, you know, I expressly said that like every sort of like geometry and subgeometry of that genetic sequence can be an antenna. So you can imagine if like you have like, let's say like haplogroup A and then haplogroup B and haplogroup C, and you have ancestors who had haplogroup A and haplogroup B and haplogroup C, then they all kind of communicate separately through those geometries. But then also, if you have ancestors who also have A, B, C in that specific order, then you can imagine that that set is also like an antenna, which probably explains like why some ancestors come through more strongly than others. And then also like, I think another piece of what I'm saying is that somebody doesn't have to be necessarily in that tree of like your mothers and fathers and mothers and fathers and mothers and fathers in order to be an ancestor. They might not even be like traceable to your family tree. They just have to have like these same geometries. But you could say like, you know, you're more likely to have ancestors who are like more closely related, who have more of these sort of like geometric alignments and therefore come through more strongly. So that kind of covers Earth ancestry, and I guess I'll stop and see if anybody has any questions or disagreements. And I'll take a sip of Costa coffee. And I'll check the chat. No. I think some of you have heard this explanation before, so apologies for the repetition, but yeah, I'll talk about sky ancestry in this way, which is that, you know, I'd say like a few different lineages, but definitely like East Asian, like folk medicine lineages talk about like babies taking their first breath of ether, like when they're born, and that becoming sort of like a natal astrological imprint. I don't think it's like literally like breathing or like just breathing, but you could say that like at the time a baby is born, there is like some vibration in like the in the ether, in the interplanetary medium. So you know, some people talk about the music of the spheres, and like for me, the way I understand that is that, you know, Earth is bobbing around in this interplanetary medium, which is mostly like coming from the sun, and then you have all these other planets like also bobbing around in this interplanetary medium, and some of them are kind of like, you know, working with it in like a slightly splashier way, and they're all like vibrating with their energy bodies, just like all of us are vibrating with our energy bodies in every moment. And the superposition of all those vibrations in the interplanetary medium has like a particular sound, right? And they keep on making music, but you could say that like when a baby is born, that instant of like the song becomes like a natal imprint. And that natal imprint is sort of like accessible from, you could say, like a space-time context, which sits in the heart space, which I've referred to before as Indra Sutra, or as the pearl that connects us. So like just as like that space-time sort of like locates a person at a particular location at a particular time within that space-time fabric that we call, let's say, like our solar system, within the space-time fabric, within that space-time fabric, which we call Earth. And, you know, it gets more like local than that. You could say that there are other perspectives of all of these like space-time contexts which are part of this fabric, which are both like vaster and then denser. So you can kind of imagine like a photo which gets more and more pixelized but stays kind of the same size. And I would call them like vaster and denser space-time fabrics. And you could also imagine that they sort of have like a Russian doll dynamic where they like sit inside one another. But then you can also imagine like space-time fabrics where they're not connected in this like hierarchical way, but that can be seen as continuous space-time fabrics from like different angles, right? So if you imagine like you're born here in like a more or less 2D fabric of space and time, and then you can imagine that there's another like space-time fabric which comes through here and it contains that space-time context, and then there's maybe like another one which like comes through here and also contains that space-time context. Then you could say that that space-time context is part of many different space-time fabrics, right? And in the past I've talked about a body as like a space-time fabric. So, you know, like sperm goes inside ovum, creates a cell, the cell divides, continues to multiply, and then you move around. And like, as you move around, it's almost like you're like smearing, like taking up space and time context. And then you're also moving around mostly in linear time. So you end up with a space-time fabric of a body, which sort of like covers all of the movements through all time of that body. And for the most part, it's continuous. And then I would say it becomes discontinuous because of ruptures and conditioning and trauma. So in that sense, you can imagine that this space-time context, which, you know, some lineages call the soul or the etheric soul, ends up being like part of this body in this plane of space and time. Then also it can be part of like other bodies in these intersecting fabrics of space and time. And then you can imagine that just the same way that like our cells in our body connect and communicate via like multiple different, you could say, material and immaterial networks of mostly like electromagnetic energy, then you can imagine that the same thing's happening in these different bodies, which are also continuous space-time fabrics in other space-time fabrics. So in that sense, you could say that this soul can connect us to like many different bodies. So like this soul can connect us throughout our earthly vessels, throughout the time that our earthly vessels are alive. And then it can also connect us to all the cells in all of those other bodies. And I feel like I've been talking pretty abstractly at this point for a while. So like I'll anchor it and say that, like, for instance, like my body, like my etheric soul feels like it's part of a body on Earth, and it's part of a body in Venus, it's part of a body in Aldebaran, it's part of a body in Regal, it's part of a body in Betelgeuse, it's part of a body in Sirius, it's part of a body in Polaris. And all of these different astral bodies have their own space-time envelopes and space-time fabrics within the space-time fabric of our galaxy. And then you could say that, like, this etheric soul is also, from my perspective, parts of bodies which are parts of vaster bodies which include our galaxy, like say Laniakea on certain timelines, and then part of like a unified, Milky Way and Andromeda on the timelines where they unify and they don't sort of like destroy each other and disintegrate one another. And yeah, I would say that basically, just like our bodies, these other bodies are kind of like always doing inner work, right? So you've talked about, I think, IFS and alchemy and healing through the lens of breaking down compartments between space-time contexts within our body, not just like across ancestry, but like within our present life vessels. Well, like to me, this process is also happening in these vast bodies that our etheric souls are part of. So you could say that like as these compartmentalizations come down in the parts of these vaster bodies which we are connected with, we gain more sky ancestors, which is like very similar to the process by which we gain more earth ancestors, and also very similar to the process by which we resolve karma in our bodies and become more integrated. And yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that question. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Lexi? Does anybody have any like, does it not make sense in any way to anybody? I feel like I'm always, something I've been talking about recently with people, well, for a while, I would say, is like how gnosis ends up becoming material, right? So like, I think like most of us probably have this like experience of feeling like there's like a shape or a texture that's kind of coming through our channel. And it's like, oh, like I'm not sure exactly like how to talk about it, right? Like I can't articulate it. Maybe like sometimes it's easier to like sing or to like draw something or to dance. But I'd say that for me, it's almost like you have this like shape and it's kind of like dipping through and then coming out of like what we like know, like conceptually in terms of form, in terms of symbol, or if symbol's kind of a form, a type of form. And then like every time that shape comes through, it's sort of like, manages to like gather forms that resemble that shape, right? Which is all to say that as these like shapes come through my channel, I am always sort of aware that I don't have like exactly the right forms. Like when I talk about forms, I'm talking about, you could say like semantic geometry is not necessarily like words, but also like arrangements between words. And so I'm only able to like partially like articulate the shape of this hyperdimensional object, which I would call like a form of gnosis. So, part of the reason I'm always open to refinement or disagreement is like I understand that my articulation of these forms is somewhat inexact and like it might be received in a way which doesn't necessarily match reality. And also I'm articulating it in ways which are just like a partial match for reality. Yeah. Always funny when people, well, in some ways it's funny when people yawn because I feel like yeah, kind of gets to like the other part of what I'm talking about, which is like hopefully I'm able to transmit these forms like non-materially, like non-symbolically as well. So um even though like the geometries which I'm dressing these forms in may be inexact, I would say that it's very likely like the forms will like they're being offered to y'all, and it will end up being like dressed in like your own symbolic material. And this is part of how we end up with many, many different articulations of like truth, right? Instead of everybody following like specific doctrines. This kind of relates to what I call seeds of seeds of seeds of life, or 000, which is the name of one of my lineages now, which is in itself like the remembering of many different lineages of Earth and from different places. Hmm. Okay, cool. So the second question is, what are angels according to your gnosis? And I'm kind of surprised I'm answering these questions with y'all because I feel like I've spoken about both of them with most of y'all like a number of times, but I also feel like it's coming through in ways which are also novel to me. So that's kind of cool. Angels. So like a really long time ago, what seems like a long time ago, I'll say January of 2022, I was in the desert in the southwest of America, and I was being like psychically attacked for like 4 or 5 days in a row. And during this time, I channeled a whole lot. I opened up a whole lot. Um, I felt like pretty vast energies were coming through some like people like unconsciously, and like kicking up resonance like in my field. And at the time I also said that, like a psychic attack could be something which is like characterized as like an energy which sort of like reverberates with your energy in a way that like um like resonance creates sort of like increasing nervous system dysregulation. And I think like it's probably fair to say that like a lot of the time, like that energy is emanated unconsciously. And I think the term psychic attack doesn't really like capture the fact that it can be kind of unintentional. And sometimes that energy is like kicked up intentionally, and um, there's all kinds of like martial energetic work which is sort of designed to do this. But I'd say like a lot of the time there's some kind of like clash of energies which creates resonance, which creates dysregulation. And then when dysregulation occurs, you could say that like our energy becomes loose, right? Like it becomes like detectable outside of um our vessel, and then it draws the attention of other beings who are like quite aware in various like, you could say like metaphysical fields, but also physical fields. Um, so yeah, like during this time, my sense was that an aspect of my sky ancestry, which I think is like mostly referred to as like Raphael or Archangel Raphael, or sometimes I call this angel like Rapha, when I talk about this angel outside of the realm of angels. But yeah, like a sky ancestor or some kind of complex of souls in my sky ancestry called Raphael was being attacked by a complex of souls that relate to an archangel named Michael, mostly Michael at the time. And at the time, I basically tweeted, angels are the shadow of Raphael. And I kind of like didn't exactly know what it meant. But, you know, like to try and explain like how I think about angels, I think that was a question. What are angels according to your narcissist? I think it's like necessary to think about like a vaster being named El. And yeah, you know, I think that like to an extent, like El is like, you know, you could say that like most human consciousness has some connection to this being named El. And I won't go too far into it right now, but I feel like based on my discussion of sky ancestry earlier, it's possible to sort of imagine how we might be connected by sky ancestry to elements of El. And then if you think about how the genetic material of humans has been cultivated by emanations in the interplanetary medium, which come from within the interplanetary medium and way beyond the interplanetary medium, like from outside our solar system, within our galaxy, and even outside of our galaxy. You could say that like in an embodied way, our vessels are very highly connected to the emanation of this being named El. And yeah, I won't go too much further into that. But part of the reason I'm talking about the body of this being named El is because from there we can kind of work down to like the level of parts, right? So like, just like I have a body, and there are like unresolved like karmic accumulations within my energy body, it's almost like my physical body ends up being sort of like fragmented into these different parts, right? So like if I'm in a certain context and I get triggered, I may go into a compartmentalization of my overall spirit, which may occupy many, many different parts throughout my body, but can still be seen as sort of like a fragment of my overall field. And I would say that there is a path of the body named El that we refer to as Adonai. And, you know, like this name is somewhat arbitrary, but I would say that like based on the way that sound connects to meaning, and then those sounds also connect to like direct experiences of spiritual energy, I would say that even though that name is in some ways arbitrary, it's also like pretty highly fixed like within our material realm. And then if you think of like these fragments of a body also having like chakra systems, then I feel like it becomes more possible to talk about angels for me. So first of all, like I would say that like the base chakra system of Adonai for me only has like 4 chakras. So there is like the crown, which is represented by Archangel Gabriel, and then the third eye, which is represented by Archangel Michael, and then the heart, which is represented by Raphael, and then the root, which is represented by Uriel. And then to like go into like the heart a little bit, I can like reconnect to what I said about angels being the shadow of Rapha or Raphael or Rapha. And I think it's then it's a little more possible to talk about what angels are. So, like I would say theologically, like Raphael is known as the one who heals God, I think. And he's like known by many other things, but I feel like that's like the definition which is like most useful for this explication. And like just like humans can be unconscious. And when we say unconscious, we mean sort of like we're not able to communicate with the parts of their self which are self-conceptualizing, and then also able to articulate their concept of self and what they're experiencing symbolically, right? um so we recognize that we can sort of be like unconscious from a self-conceptualizing self perspective, but then that we can be autonomically like maintained, right? And I think like the heart is like very much like a good, like as an example of one of these organs where like even if you're not like thinking about the heart beating, sometimes if you're thinking about the heart beating, then you can change the way the heart beats, but that's mostly because you think about things and that does something to your nervous system or your physical system, and then your heart sort of compensates for it. But like for the most part, it's pretty hard for us to like directly control our hearts, right? um so, when I talk about the shadow of Raphael and I talk about the shadow of the heart, I'm talking about the heart's sort of unconscious capacity for regulating or trying to achieve homeostasis within a body, um, at physical and metaphysical levels. So to speak of angels then is to like speak about automatic processes which happen within the consciousness of the one known as Raphael from my perspective. Um, does anybody have any questions about that so far? I kind of like went like this. I want to go a little bit deeper, but I just want to see if there's anything to refine or clarify. Maybe I'm just stalling so my channel can like open up a little bit. And also so Mika can stop fidgeting. Um, so I feel like this isn't like necessarily part of the main question, but I feel like something that's come up a lot based on conversations we've had in the broom, and also like conversations that people in the broom have had with angels and people outside of the broom as well, um, is just like ultimately like what like how to interact with angels, right? And I think um in the past I've felt guided to say that angels are demons, and I stand by that. But not necessarily in the sense that like demons are necessarily bad. So um yeah, I guess like in order to explore like that set of assertions a little more closely, I would say that there are behaviors in our body which are autonomic, which are nonetheless like out of time, right? So like one of my favorite examples of this, which doesn't necessarily relate to the heart directly, is that um like if you touch a live wire with an open hand, the way that the body reacts is to grab onto it, and then of course like you continue to get fried by the electrics, like the potential difference, like causing like currents to run through your body which your body can't handle, like it doesn't have the capacity for. um and like that's kind of an example of a behavior which is sort of out of time. Like you can imagine that like in many circumstances, the fact that our body evolved to like grab things when um currents are running through them of a certain geometry and past a certain threshold would be like really helpful for us. But in a context which is like relatively new within the time that like humans have evolved, um, which involves live wires, that behavior becomes out of date. And I would say, like, to go back to the autonomic function of the heart within our bodies and also in the body of El, or in the body that hosts the part which we know as Adonai, um, according to my gnosis. There are many like behaviors of the heart which um, evolved to contribute to the establishment and reestablishment of homeostasis within the body of El. But some of them can be like out of time, right? Or like they can no longer be useful, and they can actually like contribute to like resonance, or you could say um, increasing dysregulation. So, to go back to the questions, uh, like how are we supposed to work with angels? I would say that angels can be operating in ways which are aligned with our cosmic blueprints, which includes the blueprints of bodies which are like well outside of our solar system, and also maybe like adjacent to the body of El. Even if you could, you could say that, I mean, ouch. You could say that like behaviors which are in line with, let's say, the maintenance of the body of El can be out of line with the maintenance of vaster bodies. You could say that behaviors which are in line with the way that humans have sort of evolved to learn how to more skillfully and more devastatingly extract resources from Earth are very much out of line with like the cosmic blueprints of vaster bodies, and also out of line with the vaster body of Earth. And so in that sense, like some angels can help with our alignment with cosmic blueprints of Earth and vaster bodies, and some angels can essentially like continue the existing programming of humanity, which is ultimately, especially like over the last 50 years, resulting in the destruction of a lot of life. You could also say like the monotonization of a lot of genetic material of Earth, and also of like the human genome. And in order to discern like, I would say like the way that we think about like connecting with spiritual energy, like what's kind of like in our control is essentially like how integrated our vessel is. And then like to an extent, except for like some people, I would say like what we're actually able to connect to cosmically and in our earth ancestry is not necessarily up to our spirit in our vessel. So it's very possible that people can be like very integrated and like be part of the emanation of, say, like Archangel Michael, even though like from my perspective and the perspective of the vaster bodies that I work with, the current time behavioral patterning of the one known as Archangel Michael is to, like most humans, basically take as much awareness out of the rest of the body of El, or the body of the part known as Adonai, and dedicate it to the upper chakras, right? So, in like more grounded terms, you could say that humans more or less have like a fixation on acquiring knowledge. And you could say the same of Adonai, and you could say the same of El. And yeah, again, like people can be just like super integrated in their vessels, Nika, and then connect very cleanly to the current time incarnation of El, which has like the current time like incarnations of Michael and Jibril. And they'll ultimately still be guided to enact out behavioral patterns which contribute to what I would say like destructive human behavior. And I would say that like faster bodies which are adjacent to and outside of and including the body of L, and also like certain bodies within the body of L. You could say like within our bodies, some of our organs are like in alignment, and then some of them or some aspects of our organs are not in alignment. But you could say that some of the organs in the body of L, and then many bodies, including L and adjacent to L, are making it possible for people who are very integrated to connect into either aligned versions of Mikhail, aligned versions of Jibril, or other aligned bodies. And this is like what in the lineage of 000 I've been calling Marianda Kali, but some people refer to it as soul swapping. And yeah, I think that's like all I have to say about my neurosis of angels right now. I think it also perhaps answers a few other questions. Some of them not asked entirely yet. Am I right, Lexi? Am I right? Also definitely answered some questions that I had for myself. Cool. Yeah. Any thoughts? It's just about 10 o'clock in Sofia. I am going to post the recording on YouTube, and then I'll also link to it in the thread called 2023 July 14th. Why am I like this? If y'all have any like thoughts, refinements, questions to add, we can like chop it up in there, or you can DM me. But thank you so much for joining me for, is this the second recorded session of Why Am I Like This? I think it's the third. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you all again soon. And I also hope that if you disagree in any way, you feel safe to disagree with me, and I can continue to improve my ability to channel cleanly. All right. Peace, yeah.